Good morning, and welcome to our Sunday, July 29th, 2020, Library Reflection. I'm Chaplain Phil. I welcome all our AHPC members and friends of the church, and especially welcome others who may be curious about the church and its message and are visiting us the first time. I look forward to the day when the pandemic has lessened to where we can all meet and share our faith together. In my last reflection with you, I spoke about prejudice, how it develops, and the negative effects of it on persons and our society as a whole. I told you how fortunate I am to have been raised in a career military family where prejudice was neither taught nor displayed. I also told you about my own active duty military service, and especially my combat infantry service in Vietnam and the lessons that I learned from that. I also told you about my university years where collaterally I tutored a totally blind veteran who further taught me to try to be colorblind, just as is our God, who values each of us, you and me, equally. This morning I want to talk to you about policing or law enforcement from a Christian perspective. You may ask, logically, what does policing have to do with our Christian faith? Let's look at the what and the why of laws in human society. First, a little personal background. After graduating university and a year of graduate school and wanting a meaningful career serving others, I entered a 25-year career in law enforcement. In Vietnam, where I commanded a scout recon squad, I lost two of my men. They and their deaths affected me greatly and have affected me all of my life in a learning sort of way. And I feel compelled today, while we're taping here, to show you who they are, to make this more real to you. This is J. Allen Hurd. He was 19 years old, functioned as my radio operator, was from New Hampshire, and was shot to death right next to me at the same time I was shot when my team was ambushed. This is John Kirkland Thompson III from Virginia. John was just 18 years old. As I finished university work and prepared to choose a new career, I felt compelled to enter a career where I could serve others. I felt that I had to enter a career where I was trying to do something to justify my still being alive, while these two young men and thousands of others were dead and were never going to have an opportunity, as I had, to go on with life. So they were my motivators. And they've actually helped me all my life. When I get too full of myself, or if I'm down about something in general, it's as though I hear them say, "Hey, Sergeant, what's your problem?" Let's look at laws. Where do they come from? Well, actually, the first law was imposed by God. If you go to the Bible, to the first book in Genesis, you go to chapters 2 and 3 after the creation of the world is discussed. And in chapters 2 and 3, we're spoken to about the creation of man. First Adam, and then Eve. Later, in chapter 4, we learn about the first children, their sons, Cain and Abel. So God gave the first law to humanity when he informed Adam that he was not to partake of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. That information was also passed on to Eve. We all know the story. The serpent tempted Eve. She ate the fruit, shared it with Adam. So they were in effect the first lawbreakers of humanity. Then we go to their children, Cain and Abel. And Cain ends up committing the first homicide of mankind. So God established the first law, and humankind quickly broke it, and others. Then if you're still in Genesis, and you go to chapter 7, 6 and 7, we see that God becomes so displeased with the law-breaking, if you will, of humankind, that we have the imposition of the Great Flood. So put all this together, and all I can say is, what a beginning for mankind. So we see that from the very beginning, there was a need for humans to be governed by reasonable laws. This, of course, evolved from a faith standpoint into the Ten Commandments. In the New Testament, we read that Christ made clear what God's most important commandments were, saying in Matthew 22, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So we see clearly that Christianity has involved laws for us to follow from literally the very beginning of mankind. Now, bringing us to modern times, we see that unless a person lives a solitary, self-sufficient existence on an isolated island, we all belong to society. And every society forms its own rules for behavior based on ethics and morals and other considerations, and then codifies those rules into laws. When you have laws, a society has to have a means of enforcing those laws, and that is the genesis of law enforcement or policing. I suppose you could say regarding Adam and Eve that God was the world's first law enforcement officer. What is most important in law enforcement is whether or not the laws being enforced in a society are themselves fair and just. Societal laws are usually created by the leaders of a society, not by law enforcement officers themselves. However, how those laws are enforced is extremely important. Policing, and I'm saying this out of my 25 years of experience, is a very difficult vocation. Police officers encounter very tense situations on a routine basis. It's a hazardous profession where violent behavior is often encountered. And law enforcement officers are the only vocational group outside of the military in wartime who are authorized to use deadly force. It's an extreme amount of power given, and one that requires great care. It is, in policing, a very stressful occupation. Police are often not welcomed in what they do, unlike perhaps firemen when we have a fire. It is a necessary occupation, but if not done appropriately, even-handedly, it can create very negative consequences, not just to individuals, but to an entire society. The best law enforcement officers are deeply motivated by a sense of duty to serve and to protect the innocent from criminals. The very best law enforcement officers can sustain this sense of duty and at the same time retain a calm, even-handed demeanor, treating everyone they encounter, even suspects, with respect and dignity until that person exhibits behavior which calls for a different approach. I'll give you a very quick, somewhat humorous, true example. I spent my first 3 years in law enforcement as an adult probation officer and a credentialed, licensed deputy sheriff. I dealt with nothing but felony cases, ostensibly supervised hundreds of felons, did precinct investigation reports for criminal district courts, and arrested those who violated their terms of probation. I then became a federal agent and spent 22 years until retirement, totaling 25 years in law enforcement. When I was first sworn in as a special agent, the special agent in charge of the New Orleans Field Division, which was going to be my first assigned area, swore me in and then apologized because the director of the Bureau had the final signature approval on my credentials, which after he and I, the special agent in charge, and I signed them, had to be forwarded to Washington, D.C., so that temporarily I did not have my credentials. I had simply the big federal gold badge with the U.S. He gave me his badge until I would receive my credential package from Washington. I then went with my new boss to my first office in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where we were just establishing a new office, and consequently I was the first worker bee special agent there. My new boss took off for Thanksgiving, which ostensibly left me as the agent in charge with 4 days on the job and without my own credentials, only having my big boss's badge. I still had to work, so the day after Thanksgiving, and got in our government car, turned on the radio, police radio, called me, asked me to respond immediately to the Baton Rouge Police Department headquarters. I did not even yet know where it was. Finally found it, went in, found a gaggle of police officers waiting for me, waiting to see what this federal agent was like. They had just arrested a man well known to them, a career criminal who had served numerous terms in state prison, had fought them when they arrested him. He was armed with an illegal weapon, a sawed-off shotgun. They knew that the federal penalties for that was far greater than the state, consequently, my being called. So, the man is being held in a holding cell. This is a rough-looking guy. He's been handled by the police all his life. He's got some marks from his fights with the police. They say, "Do you want us to come in the cell with you?" I said, "No, that's fine, not a problem," but they stood outside watching. I walked in. All I did was I said, "How you doing?" I held up the gold federal badge. I said, "My name's Phil. I'm a federal agent. I'd like to talk to you for a minute. Is that okay?" The man's whole demeanor changed. He called me sir. I sat down. He wrote out a confession, and that was my first case as a federal agent. The point to the story is that by simply approaching him in an even-handed way, instead of coming in and trying to drumbeat something out of him, he responded in a positive way. It amazed all the police officers. I think it was actually due to this man having watched too many years of the early days of TV with Jack Webb or someone else on TV portraying an FBI agent. But when we treat people with dignity, even criminals, we are treating the law, using the law in a fair and even-handed way. However, to be honest, and from my experience and all my years in law enforcement, there are those in law enforcement, just like every other vocation, who shouldn't be there. There are people who use the power granted to law enforcement officers for personal benefit, which may be something really bad, such as some form of criminal activity, or may simply be using that authority to exert influence over others in a negative sort of way. When something outrageous is done by a member of law enforcement, it's obvious that they're ill-suited to the profession. There are problems in trying to screen people prior to entering the profession to ensure that they won't turn into those types of law enforcement officers that abuse their power. But that's difficult. But agencies do need a means of quickly removing those who abuse their power. Today, unfortunately, I am, as a citizen, seeing some abuses of law enforcement power, some of which are egregious and criminal, others of which are maybe more subtle, but for someone like me, with a quarter century of police experience, I can still see that in other cases, perhaps in dealing with legitimate protests, that some officers are really carrying perhaps their enforcement authority too far. I'll speak just briefly, since this is a current issue, about the many protests that we are seeing in our society now. Again, based on my own experience, when you have legitimate protests, there is always an element, often an outside element, that will use that event in order to do things that are counter to the matter which is the subject of the protest, meaning that there are those who will loot, damage property, otherwise use the event for their own purposes. So in the current climate of protest in our country, I hope we can look at protest as being a legitimate activity of our citizens, not focus on some of the negative things that are being done by a very small minority of people and should not be condoned by any of us. In part, the greater than necessary response by police that we may see sometimes today is, in my opinion, due to a militarization of policing that I experienced beginning around the late 1980s. Many departments from the local level up to the federal level began receiving a lot of surplus military equipment, everything from basic items up to including large vehicles, which for the most part you had never seen before associated with police departments. At the same time, and I can't explain all the reasons in our society, but we began to have more and more militarization in regards to military-style firearms becoming common, both on the police side and on the civilian side. Again, on the policing side, we started wearing protective vests, which we had never done for probably the first 15 years of my 25-year career. And what I found then, and I see now, is that the more militarization that police departments have, the more there's a similar response from the public, meaning the public feels more confronted when the police are dressed and equipped more like infantry soldiers in the military. And I can tell you honestly, when you're wearing all of that equipment, because I have done that or did that during my career, when you're layered with a protective vest of a level that'll stop rifle rounds, and you have a Kevlar helmet, and you have all of this other equipment, you're looking out at the world in a different sort of way. It really reminded me of how, as a combat soldier, looked out on our environment. So it's simply an observation as to perhaps why policing has become more militarized, but the problem it's brought about is I think it's made policing more confrontational. So, where does all of this leave us? I think first we have to agree that laws are necessary for the functioning of a society, and we should agree that those laws must be fair and just. Second, I think we can agree that law enforcement is necessary and should be performed by dedicated professionals whose true goal is to serve and protect all citizens of our country in a fair, just, and even-handed manner. We should all support and assist such dedicated police professionals because they are there for our society as a whole. Lastly, we, all of us, need to abide by God's commandments, especially in terms of loving and caring for each other. We may need laws to control our human behavior, just as did Adam and Eve, but the better we each attempt to follow God's commandments, the less need we have as a society for law enforcement. I have no illusions that mankind is going to ever live in total peace and have no need for laws and police. Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel proved that from the very beginning of mankind. Nonetheless, if we, you and I, were simply to try to fully abide by God's commandments, we'd go a long ways toward that goal. In the meantime, I ask you to love your God by loving others in His name. Sometimes that's all we can do, one by one. May God bless and keep you and your family in His holy name. Amen.
Your